This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Today's episode is part of a series we're producing together with Israel in Depth, the podcast of the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. The director of the center, Dov Waxman, is joining me again as co-host. He's a professor of political science and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Israel Studies at UCLA. Hello, Dov, and welcome back.
Hello, Gilad. Happy to be here.
And our guest today is a distinguished professor of history at the University of Maryland, specializing predominantly in 20th century European history. His 2016 book, Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany and the West German Far Left, 1967 to 1989, featured on the Tel Aviv Review when it came out. And now we are delighted to have him back on to discuss his latest book, Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949, which was published earlier this year by Cambridge University Press. Professor Jeffrey Herf, welcome back to the Tel Aviv Review.
It's a great pleasure to be back on the program and to be participating in conversation with you and Professor Waxman.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. So your book focuses on the very few years that were the twilight zone, in inverted commas, between the end of the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War. Now, before we discuss Israel's creation against this backdrop, can you lay out the international scene for us? What were the main changes in the world order that stood out for you for the purpose of this inquiry?
Well, the title, Israel's Moment, as you just indicated, refers to 4 years, and especially to 2 years, when there was a extremely unusual agreement between between Stalin and the West, the Soviet Union and the West, and that agreement in favor of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine reflected the very fresh memories of World War II and the Holocaust, and viewed the establishment of the Jewish state as a continuation of the anti-fascist passions of the Second World War. The fact that Israel was established in 1948 was remarkable because it was in just those very months, literally months, from spring of 47 to the early 1949, that the Cold War also broke out. And so these two eras of World War II and the Cold War, of anti-fascism and anti-communism, were in contention with one another. And for listeners, especially younger listeners, who are familiar with the political moods of the last several decades, last 5 decades really, Israel's Moment will come as a bit of a surprise to at least some of them, because the greatest passion and the greatest support for the establishment of the Jewish state came from liberals in the United States and leftists in the United States and in Europe, and from the Soviet bloc. And the greatest opposition to it, aside from the Arab League and the Palestinian leadership, the greatest opposition to it came from the British Foreign Office and the State Department and the Pentagon in the United States, all of whom viewed the Jewish state as a potential threat to access to Arab oil, and viewed it also as a potential Trojan horse for the expansion of communism in the Middle East. So the book, historians have a expression, the past is a foreign country, and those years illustrate or demonstrate a spectrum of political opinions and engagements that sounds quite foreign, at least very different from what people are accustomed to hearing, at least since the 1960s. So that summarizes about 500 pages in 60 seconds. And the book is filled with lots and lots of details that are equally interesting. But that's the core of it in brief.
So could you talk us through the kind of the diplomacy leading up to this pivotal vote in the United Nations in November of 1947? You make the point that it was the Soviet Union that was kind of driving force behind the UN vote, behind the positive outcome. To what extent was this driven by the Cold War logic versus the memory of the Holocaust? I mean, was it really about realpolitik first and foremost, or were there other considerations?
Well, if you're thinking about the United States, the American Jewish community, politicians, liberal politicians in the United States, and even some not so liberal politicians, the memory of the Holocaust was crucial, and the basic argument from Thucydides that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must was the driving force of the Zionist project, especially for secular Zionists, and that was on the minds of political leaders and journalists and in the Jewish community and in the United States, among French socialists, Gaullists, communists, British liberals, but Stalin, who, as we know, was himself capable of a great deal of anti-Semitism, thought that the meeting of hearts and minds during World War II between Jews and communists would continue after the war, and that perhaps this new state of Israel would be sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And so why not take a chance and see if it works out, support Jewish immigration to pre-state Palestine, and hopefully the Jewish state would help to erode British influence in the Middle East. So Stalin was primarily operating in response directly to your question on power political concerns. But at the United Nations, Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet representative, and Alfred Fedorkiewicz, the Polish representative, the representatives of Czechoslovakia, when they spoke at the United Nations, they were the only ones in 1947-48 who spoke specifically about what almost nobody used the term Holocaust then, but who spoke about the Nazi extermination of the Jews of Europe. And Fedorkiewicz stunned his UN colleagues when he said, when he revealed that he was a survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So for those gentlemen, power politics was infused also with political passions and memories and emotions. So it was a mixture of those things. And the establishment of the State of Israel was a cause célèbre of the left around the world, outside the Arab states, between 1945 and 49.
But as you say in the book, it's not just a certain emotional politics about the memory of the Jews or a certain depth of history to the Jews for what they have suffered. It was also driven by a very leftist logic of anti-colonialism or perhaps post-colonialism, even though I'm not sure the term even existed at the time. But anti-imperialism. It also had a cold political considerations to the support of the establishment of the State of Israel, right?
It's a book about political language. And if I would have the opportunity to sit down and talk with the editors of Haaretz, I would say, when you use words like racism and colonialism and imperialism, think about what they meant in 1945, 6, 7, 8. And to be an anti-imperialist or an anti-colonialist or an anti-racist, all those sentiments were pro-Zionist. The Zionist project was one directed against British power in the Middle East. And frankly, and this has been forgotten or underemphasized, the Palestinian leadership, and not only Haj Amin al-Husseini, but also Jamal Husseini, the Arab Higher Committee's representative at the United Nations, made quite explicitly racist arguments as to why a Jewish state should not be established in the Middle East. That the Middle East was supposedly a racial homogeneity and the Jews would be an alien presence. And these were comments made. And so when Frieda Kirchhoy, the editor of The Nation, or I.F. Stone, a journalist, or Robert Wagner, a senator, when they heard that, they associated racism with the Palestinian leadership. And not to mention Nazi collaboration with the Nazis. That's another story. So it's what Israel's moment attempts to do is to remind a readership of the meaning of famous words that were very different than the meanings those words came to have in global politics, especially since the 1970s.
So, in a sense, it's a reminder, particularly to the left, that Zionism was once a left-wing cause, and that the left played a central role in the establishment of Israel, and saw Israel then as fulfilling their values rather than as contradicting them, as many leftists see that today. I wonder, to what extent was this a united position? I mean, I know the British government at the time, Labour government, did not take that view, and obviously went to some length. So what were the debates? Were there debates within the left? I mean, was this an argument between liberals and leftists, between kind of the Labour Party and socialists, as we see today, or was it generally regarded as a left-wing cause, and the British government was the outlier?
Well, if you regard Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister, as part of the left, and I think that he was
in British political history is certainly
he is in British political history a man of the left, emergence out of the labor movement, and was one of those famous left of center anti-communists at the beginning of the Cold War. Then if one thinks about Bevin, then I would say the answer to your question is yes. But Bevin's opposition to the Zionist project had everything to do with his anti-communism, and with his focus on the importance of launching the Cold War. That's also uncomfortable for people to hear today. The anti-communist argument in those months and years was an anti-Zionist argument, and those older associations of the Jews and communism then evolved into an association of Zionism and the Soviet Union. So the short answer to your question, Dov, is that no, there was not. In New York and Washington and Paris, there wasn't a, quote, debate within the left about the Zionist project. There was a huge unified support. Now, when Stalin changed his mind and the Soviet Union, turned on Israel, then the loyal communists in the West and the United States, of course, went along with the Soviet turn. But then there were a lot of people who, there were many members of the communist parties in Britain and in the United States who left the parties after the Soviet turn. So the kind of debate within the left that has received so much attention in the last, especially the last 10, 20 years, no, that didn't exist in 45 to 49.
How important was this as an issue in global terms? I mean, we've come to take it for granted that the issue of Israel-Palestine and the conflict is one of these kind of dominant issues and has captured the world's attention. Was it at that time a major issue, or was it a sideshow? I mean, there's many other things happening at the time. Obviously, the emergence of the Cold War, incipient decolonization, civil war in China. So in global terms, was this a blip on the map? I mean, was this just a story that was important, obviously, for Jews and Arabs, but not really central in global diplomacy at the time? Or was it even then an issue which had captured the world's attention?
It depends for whom. For the United Nations, it was hugely important. This was the most discussed issue at the UN in its founding weeks and months. So the emotions of the issue dominated discussions at the United Nations. That is clear. And the United Nations, the records of the United Nations are fascinating, and for students and scholars out there, they're available at the official document system of the United Nations, many of them, and I found working with them very interesting. But from the perspective of the makers of American foreign relations, the establishment of the State of Israel was a sideshow. And the main event of those years was shifting the gears of American foreign policy from the, quote, the United Nations fighting against Nazi Germany, which is where the organization got its name, shifting away from the emotions and strategies of the United Nations to containment of the Soviet Union. And President Truman gave the Truman Doctrine speech in March of 47. Secretary of State Marshall gave the Marshall Plan speech at Harvard in June of 47. That was the main event. far and away much, much more important than the issue of the establishment of the Jewish state. Now, the Zionist issue was important in a strategic perspective because of the oil. And all the arguments about oil also cut against the establishment of the Jewish state in Washington and in London. But when Secretary of State George Marshall and the director of the policy planning staff George Kennan and Deputy Secretary of State Robert Lovett and Loy Henderson, who was director of the Middle East Division in the State Department, when they all were making decisions about opposing the partition resolution or imposing an arms embargo or trying to deprive Israel of the Negev desert in the summer of 48. All of that was against the background of launching containment and making the American-British alliance the priority. And that's a very important point. Also, another important point your question raises is how little power Jews had in the United States. And as you both know, over the years, people have claimed that there was this enormous Jewish lobby in Washington, and Israel was established against our national interests and all that. But when push came to shove and the Jews needed weapons during the war, and Emanuel Seller and Robert Wagner and other politicians were urging the United States to lift the arms embargo, no, they failed. So Truman did a great deal. President Truman did a very great deal. But one of the most compelling documents in the book was a discussion that the first American ambassador to Israel, James McDonald, had with David Ben-Gurion and then Foreign Minister Moshe Sharett. And basically, I'm trying to save time. I don't want to go into the whole context of the discussion. But Ben-Gurion said to McDonald that if in 1947 and 48, the Jews in Palestine had to depend upon the United States, these are Ben-Gurion's words via McDonald, the Jews would have been exterminated. So there's a lot of romance in the United States about how important the United States was. It was very important, and Truman was very important. There's no, that's very clear. But the notion that Jewish power was a factor, no.
So how do you explain the fact that Truman basically ran against near consensus in his own administration and supported the establishment of Israel?
I think that Harry Truman should be understood as part of a chapter in the history of Protestantism, along with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. And these three representative figures in the history of Anglo-American Protestantism, they viewed Judaism as the fortunate predecessor to Christianity. And they viewed the prophetic tradition as one that prefigured Jesus. And that the world, the Western world, the Christian world, owed a huge debt to the Jews for inventing monotheism or recognizing it. And that Hitler and the Nazis were an attack on them. And that in killing the Jews, Hitler had done something horrendous to everything they believed in as Christians. I think that was very powerful. And none of those three gentlemen wore their religion on their sleeve. And they didn't go on and on about how devout and pious they were in public. But I think that when Truman made that decision to recognize the state, I think that was a very important factor.
Do you think Roosevelt would have made a similar decision? I know as a historian, you may not like these kind of counterfactuals, but obviously, Truman was a novice in foreign affairs, a kind of accidental president in some respects. Roosevelt, on the other hand, may have taken a different tack. I mean, although he's lionized by American Jews, I mean, we remember his administration's actions during the Holocaust, or lack of actions vis-a-vis Jews. So would Roosevelt, do you think, have done that? I mean, all three men, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Truman, may have had sympathy toward the Zionist cause. There was also some amount of anti-Semitic sentiment there as well.
Well, we are talking about a hypothetical, and goodness, I mean, Franklin Roosevelt was so damn young when he died. It was horrible. The greatest president. Only Lincoln comes close. But on the one hand, Roosevelt had fought World War II with George Marshall and with And so there was that Anglo-American bond was very important for Roosevelt. There's no question about that. On the other hand, he was the first major national politician in American history to have publicly and clearly made known that he had Jewish friends and that he had Jewish advisors. He appointed Jews to positions in administration. He had no patience for anti-Semitism whatsoever. And he was the greatest political figure in American history since Lincoln. So if in 1947, George Marshall said, Mr. President, we need the oil and the Jews are going to help the Soviet Union, Roosevelt would say, George, this is my policy. I'm Franklin Roosevelt. If you don't like it, you can resign. And I, as Roosevelt, I can survive a resignation even of George Marshall. But Harry Truman couldn't do that.
You're saying that the supporters of the establishment of Israel, both in the Soviet Union and the United States, were driven by some sort of an ethical compass, whether it was the Protestant ethics or an anti-imperialist drive. And I'm wondering about the other camp. You're painting it as some sort of like a cold, calculated, realpolitik sort of considerations, whether it's for oil or for containment of the Soviet Union. And I'm wondering whether in that camp there was also any sort of ethical considerations involved, because it was really in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. I'm sure that even George Marshall was not blind to the destruction of the Jews of Europe. And I'm asking myself whether they could have just said, we fought now tooth and nail to rid Europe of the danger of Hitlerism. Europe is now peaceful again and safe for everyone, including the Jews. Why do we have to stick with Zionism as the only solution to the problem of the Jews of Europe now that Hitlerism is gone?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question. Marshall and Kennan and the leaders of the State Department and in the British Foreign Office viewed the establishment of the Jewish state as a threat to American and British national security. And they didn't take that position because they were waving the banner of global anti-colonialism or because they never made arguments that Zionism was unjust. Now, there was a consultant named William Eddy who worked for the Arab American Oil Corporation, Aramco, and he denounced Zionism as a form of theocracy. But there was not an ethical argument made. Remember that one reason that there wasn't an ethical argument that was more prominent in those days, and as this may be broadcast on November 29th, it's important to keep this in mind. The petition resolution called for the establishment of an Arab state. So many people said, well, what's the problem? There's a state for the Jews and a state for the Arabs. What is your problem? Why don't you want a state on more than half of what's there? So the Arab position also undermined support in Europe and the United States because they rejected this very famous compromise.
So you write about the role that Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the the political leader.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, he infamously allied with Nazi Germany during the war, broadcast Nazi propaganda, recruited Bosnian Muslims to participate in the Holocaust. How do you see his role in this? Was there perhaps could there have been another Palestinian leader who may have actually supported this, the partition resolution? Was this a unified Palestinian position opposing partition, or was it, Haj Amin al-Husseini as a kind of hardliner who really determined that opposition to partition?
Well, he had a lot of support. He had a lot of support in the Arab League, and he had a lot of support in Palestine. When he returned from Paris and came to Cairo, the Palestinian leadership didn't have to elect him as head of the Arab hierarchy.
He had rivals as well. He had a lot of Palestinian rivals who.
Right. one of Husseini's kind of Houdini-like accomplishments had been to have collaborated with the Nazis but not paid a political price for it after the war. So I'm a historian of Germany, and as you both know, after 1945 and 49, there were ex-Nazis who returned to West German politics, and it was an era of considerable cynicism, and there were people who discovered the virtues of liberal democracy and human rights in a matter of months, and but they didn't. But if they wanted to return to politics in West Germany, they couldn't do it as Nazis. Or they couldn't repeat the arguments of about the Jews or whatever. Husseini was able to return to a position of political influence without abandoning any of the views that he had expressed in Berlin during the war on the radio in Arabic. And that was, I argue, an avoidable disaster that the United States and the Allies should have put him on trial for incitement during the war. He didn't do things for which he should have been executed, no, but he should have been indicted and found guilty for what were then defined as war crimes and spent some time in prison. And that would have ruined or at least dented his political career, I think. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe he would be celebrated as a hero in prison. But the point is that the United States and France and Britain and the Soviet Union, they didn't even try. Right? And I think that was a strategic blunder. And the French government had him in custody for a whole year. And the book has a couple chapters about that. And the French saw him as an asset to restore their influence in the region, and did not send him into custody either with the British or to the Nuremberg trials. And that, I think, was unfortunate.
I want to go back to the considerations of the American administration. Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union supported the establishment of Israel, seeing it as perhaps a strategic asset in the long run. And instinctively, I thought that maybe the opposition in Washington would be some sort of like a zero-sum game, right? If the Soviets support it, then we have to oppose it. But then again, those people who were in the heart of the diplomatic making, did they not know that it wasn't really a truthful or a realistic expectation on the part of Moscow that the Zionist leadership had been pro-Western, pro-British for so long, and even in the tail end of the British Mandate, increasingly pro-American, especially Ben-Gurion, whose pro-American sentiments were probably already known back then?
It was a sobering experience reading the documents of the State Department, Gilad. The lack of understanding of who David Ben-Gurion was and what David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Shertok believed, what the Zionists believed, is very sobering. They didn't understand that the Zionist leadership believed in democracy, had no interest in dictatorships of any kind. And it's sobering to read through those documents. There's really no other way to put it.
There wasn't even one man who could have foreseen the special relationship that would emerge years later between Israel and America.
Well, there was one man, yes, there was, and his name is James MacDonald.
Right.
And James MacDonald became the first ambassador to Israel, and Truman appointed him as the ambassador, and MacDonald infuriated the rest of the State Department because he had a direct line to the president's phone number, and he could contact the president directly without having to go through Marshall. But he was the exception that proved the rule.
So I want to ask you a little bit about the rest of the world. I mean, we focus, a lot on the superpowers and their considerations in supporting partition, but obviously the partition plan would not have passed if it hadn't got that crucial 2/3 majority in the General Assembly.
Yes.
How did that 2/3 majority came about? Was that really the result, particularly the number of Latin American and Caribbean countries that supported the partition plan, that supported the resolution? Was that really the result of American pressure, lobbying, or inducements or threats, or do they have their own considerations in supporting a
I don't
partition?
know. I think there are other historians who have looked at that much more closely than I have. Was there American pressure? I'm sure. Did the State Department say that yes, the United States would look favorably on a positive vote? And I'm sure that went on. But I think you should ask Raanan Rine at the Tel Aviv University about that question. He would have. I'm sure he's thought about it a lot.
Historian of Latin America. Yeah.
He would have a much better answer than I have about that question. The State Department people and Loy Henderson claimed that the reason the Latin American countries were voting for partition was because Jewish organizations were interfering somehow and trying to influence their votes. So he was quite irritated. But yeah, I think ask Raanan Rine about that. He would know much more than I.
I want to ask you about France, Jeffrey. Now, I mean, we talked about Soviet Union and the United States, and the emergence of the Cold War. So their considerations and their strategic interests are pretty clear. But how did Israel's moment play out in a place like France?
Well, French politics created coalition governments, and that meant that the ministries of foreign affairs and defense were held by the right-of-center parties, and the ministries of transport and interior that regulated ports and visas and the judicial system were held by the socialists. So the foreign ministry in Paris, the Quai d'Orsay, on the whole, reflected the ideas of the British Foreign Office and the American State Department and looked askance at the Zionist project. The Interior Ministry, led by Adrien Tixier first, who died much too young, and then Edward Depreux and Jules Moch, the socialists supported the Zionist project, and they also worked closely with the Mossad as it was attempting to facilitate a, quote, clandestine Jewish immigration to pre-state Palestine. And the French Interior Ministry facilitated immigration from the ports on the Mediterranean, especially Marseille, knowing full well that the British Foreign Office was opposed to it. Aryeh Kochavi in Haifa has written much earlier about this, and with work in the French archives, I was able to elaborate more on it. The French socialists, Gaullists, and communists, frankly, even in 47, 48, were supporting the Zionist project. The same was probably true. I didn't work on Italy, but I would imagine Italian socialists and communists had a similar role because Italian ports were also very important for the immigration. The French socialists were convinced that the Zionists would be an asset, that the Zionists were Democrats, small d. They were not the instruments of Soviet expansion. And France played a more significant role in this story than is sometimes acknowledged. Let me just say, just very, very briefly, one of the great pleasures in working on the book was to draw attention to the scholarship by Israeli historians, by my friend Benny Morris, by Tuvia Freeling, but by a senior generation of Shlomo Slonim and Yuri Bialer. Their work is superb and important, and Yaakov Roy. There are others. I'm sure there are names that I'm not mentioning that I should mention, but there's a splendid Israeli scholarship about these years, and even a larger scholarship in Hebrew, which I don't read. So one of the things about Israel's moment that I'm very pleased about is that it's a book that brings that scholarship to the attention of readers in the English-speaking audience.
Before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, Jeffrey, Israel's moment. Again, I didn't want to ask this counterfactual, but since you handled the previous one so well, I will take the liberty of asking this one. If the Cold War had matured or come to a full fruition earlier than the very late 1940s, do you think that the creation of Israel in the way that it was created would have been averted?
Yes. In writing Israel's moment, I came to a deeper appreciation of David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharett, who, in my view, emerge as some of the greatest political figures of the 20th century in world politics. Because what Ben-Gurion understood at the time, not in retrospect, but he understood at the time, that the opportunity to create the Jewish state was very, very fleeting. And Stalin could change his mind on a dime. And that it would be extremely difficult to establish the Jewish state in the face of opposition from the Soviet bloc. And he understood that. And so he had no illusions. In that sense, he was very Churchillian. And he and Churchill exchanged some very nice letters to one another after the war. And they had a great deal of respect for one another. And Churchill understood that he was to put it mildly, no admirer of Stalin, but he understood the need for the alliance with the Soviet Union in 1941. And Ben-Gurion, too, had no illusions about Stalin, but he had to seize the moment. That it needed to be done then. And if he didn't do it then, it would not necessarily be impossible, but it would have been far more difficult. Because the Jews, and let's recall this, and my colleague Anita Shapira from Tel Aviv University has made this point to me often, that people talk about how important the Holocaust was for the establishment of the State of Israel, but Anita pointed out they killed 6 million people. How can that be helpful to anything? The Jews were atrociously weak. There were few, very few. They didn't have a state. And Ben-Gurion understood that as well. So there are moments when political judgment and decisiveness are really history making, and this is one of them. There was nothing. Let me put it this way: there was nothing inevitable about the establishment of the State of Israel. It was not inevitable.
When you talk about the importance of the Holocaust in this, obviously there wasn't just the question of the 6 million murdered, but the nearly 250,000 who were displaced. Mm-hmm. The issue of Jewish displaced persons and the need to resettle them. Mm-hmm. Cynically, you could look at this support in Western capitals for partition and the establishment of a Jewish state as a way to avoid taking in those 250,000 Jewish refugees and displaced persons.
You hit the nail on the head. The David Nassau at the City University of New York and Graduate Center in the City University of New York has written a fine book. Perhaps you've read it, The Last Million. And there were American senators who were warning about bringing all these Jews and communists to the United States, while at the same time that they were welcoming Nazi collaborationists from Eastern Europe because they were, quote, anti-communists. So, yes, there was that kind of sentiment. And I think, as you both know, anti-Semitism in the United States increased during the course of the Holocaust, and actually reached a peak, according to public opinion surveys, when American soldiers hit the beaches in Normandy. According to public opinion polls, that's when anti-Semitism in American history reached its peak.
So the interesting thing was then, I suppose, anti-Semitism and Zionism, anti-Semites may have supported Zionism rather than opposed Zionism. We take somebody like Stalin, obviously, who was already carrying out anti-Semitic actions against Soviet Jews, at the same time as being the crucial world leader in terms of supporting partition and agreeing to arm, through the Czechs, arm the Zionists.
If I understand, anti-Semites in the United States did not support the Zionist project. They would have been accepting arguments about that Zionism was yet another example of Jewish aggression, and that the anti-Semitic argument, there wasn't, at least I didn't see it, that people said, oh yes, this is great. Let's support the Zionist project so the Jews won't come here. No, the anti-Semitic argument was, we don't care about these people in displaced persons camp. We don't want them to have a state of their own either, because we can't stand the Jews. Those were the moods of those years. I don't think there was great relief. Oh, yes, this is marvelous. The Jews have a state, and now they won't come to the United States. No. The Jews are trouble wherever they are.
Well, and on this note, I think we'll end this. Yeah, exactly. Far from it. Professor Jeffrey Herf, author of the newly published Israel's Moment, International Support and Opposition to Establishing the Jewish State, 1945 to 1949. Thank you very much for being with us today. And many thanks to you as well, Dov. To many more.
My pleasure, thank you.
And to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, it's up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews, all free for download. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And from me here in Tel Aviv and from our friends across the pond, goodbye.